kindness is shown to all by Esther, Ada, and their benefactor John Jarndyce. Serial success. Bleak House is also arguably one of the earliest detective novels in English literature. The detective is Mr. Bucket, a genial, terrier-like man, who, after a ghastly murder, tracks down the culprit. Dickens creates false clues in this subplot. These appeared tantalizingly as cliffhangers at the end of 2 installments, keeping readers in suspense and eager to read more. Some early reviews were critical of Bleak House, feeling that it was too gloomy and lacking in humor. Dickens' friend and biographer John Forster described it as too real, but readers clearly disagreed. Sales were between 34,000 and 43,000 copies a month. Following the success of Dickens, other writers also gained readers via serialization. Wilkie Collins' detective novel The Moonstone first appeared in installments, and episodes of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes tales were published in the Strand magazine. Outside Britain, Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina was published serially, as was Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. Radio and television eventually took over from magazine serials, but in 1984 U.S. writer Tom Wolfe returned to serialization with The Bonfire of the Vanities, which was first published in Rolling Stone magazine. Dickens treats the locations in Bleak House almost as characters in their own right. Vividly portrayed, they serve as a shorthand for class and provide a credible backdrop for people of very different social status to meet and interact. Charles Dickens. Born in Portsmouth, England, on February 7, 1812, Charles Dickens was the second of 8 children. When he was 12, his father was imprisoned for debt. Charles left school and worked in a shoeblacking factory, a grim experience that he would describe in David Copperfield. Later he worked as a legal clerk and started writing as a journalist. In 1836 Dickens married Catherine Hogarth and began work on the Pickwick Papers, establishing his reputation as a novelist. Over the next 30 years, he published 12 major novels. He also edited periodicals and wrote numerous articles, short stories, and plays. He separated from Catherine in 1858, having fathered 10 children. Dickens died in 1870 and was buried in Poets' Corner, Westminster Abbey. Other key works. 1836, 37 The Pickwick Papers 1837, 39 Oliver Twist 1843 A Christmas Carol 1849, 50 David Copperfield 1855, 57 Little Dorrit 1859 A Tale of Two Cities 1860, 61 Great Expectations 1864, 65 Our Mutual Friend. See also, Oliver Twist The Count of Monte Cristo Vanity Fair David Copperfield Madame Bovary The Moonstone. Further reading. René. François-René Chateaubriand. The melancholic figure of René, wandering the lands from France to the Americas, finding only ennui both in the city and the countryside, offered a perfect protagonist for early Romanticism. René by French writer, diplomat, and politician Chateaubriand shocked readers with its plot revelation that René's sister Amélie joined a convent to conquer her feelings of incestuous love. The novella was an instant success. The Sketch Book of Geoffrey Crayon, Gent. Washington Irving. Penned by U.S. writer Washington Irving, The Sketch Book is a collection of short stories and essays. It includes tales such as Rip Van Winkle, in which the main character sleeps through the War of Independence, and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, with its account of Ichabod Crane's pursuit by the Headless Horseman. Irving's book was one of the first American literary works to be successfully received in Britain and Europe, and raised the reputation of American literature in the early 19th century. Ivanhoe. Sir Walter Scott. Set in 12th century England, Ivanhoe was based on the tensions between the brutal Norman rulers and the dispossessed Saxon population. Scott's romance tells the love story of two highborn Saxons, Rowena and Ivanhoe. They live alongside many noble and ignoble knights who duel and joust. Legendary figure Robin Hood makes an appearance as an outlaw with exemplary archery skills and a compelling sense of justice. Scott's characterization in Ivanhoe helped rejuvenate Robin Hood's reputation for a Victorian readership. Sir Walter Scott. Scott was born in Edinburgh, and Scotland is central to much of his work. Considered by some to be the inventor and greatest exponent of the historical novel, Scott's childhood love of nature, the Scottish landscape, and traditional folktales helped to foster his strong sense of national identity. In poetry and prose, Walter Scott's meshing of romance and historical fiction set against the passionate depiction of his homeland, especially in the Waverley novels, which he wrote anonymously, delighted huge audiences and changed the way Scotland was viewed culturally. Scott suffered ill health for much of his life, finally sailing to Italy for respite, before dying at Abbotsford, the estate he had built over many years in Scotland, in 1832. Key works: 1810 The Lady of the Lake, 1814 Waverley, 1820 Ivanhoe, The Last of the Mohicans, James Fenimore Cooper. Set in the 1750s at the height of the 7 Years' War, known in the USA as the French and Indian War, The Last of the Mohicans tells of Chingachgook and his son Uncas, the eponymous last pure-blooded member of the Mohican tribe. U.S. writer Cooper details their brave efforts, with their white trapper friend Natty Bumppo, to save innocent lives. By far the most popular of the 5-part series, The Leatherstocking Tales, Cooper's novel helped to create several enduring stereotypes of the Western genre, such as the romantic notion of the brave, fearless frontiersman and the wise, stoic indigenous tribesman. The Red and the Black. Stendhal. Told over 2 volumes, The Red and the Black describes the formative years of Julian Sorel, a provincial young man who attempts to scale the social order in 19th-century France. Through detailed personal, historical, and psychological accounts of Julian's early life, from his beginnings as the sensitive child of a carpenter, to his rise into upper-class echelons via affairs with aristocratic women, the book leads up to Sorel's eventual fall into disgrace. French writer Stendhal set his novel in early 19th-century France, both parodying and satirizing the excesses of the Bourbon regime prior to the July Revolution of 1830. Old Goriot. Honor de Balzac. Set in Paris in 1819, Old Goriot by Balzac tells of life during the Bourbon Restoration. The 1789 revolution seems far away, though class divisions are tense once more. Balzac employed realist depiction in recounting his brutal vision of early 19th-century Paris society, and in particular the social climbers willing to tread on others to achieve their ends. Considered by many to be his finest novel, it was the first of Balzac's stories to feature characters from his other books, a practice that became a trademark of his fiction. Fairy tales. Hans Christian Andersen. Danish writer Hans Christian Andersen created some of his fairy tales by retelling tales he heard as a child and others by inventing his own bold, original stories. Published in 3 volumes, Fairy Tales consists of 9 tales, including classics such as The Princess and the Pea, The Little Mermaid, and The Emperor's New Clothes. Andersen's works prefigured the explosion of children's literature in the 19th century and continue to hold enormous cultural significance today. Kalevala. Elias Elnrot. Taken from folklore tales of the Karelian and Finnish indigenous peoples, the Kalevala, meaning the land of Kaleval, is a collection of epic poetry that is considered one of the most significant works of Finnish literature. Brought together by the ethnographic research of Finnish doctor and philologist Elias Lönnrot, who traveled across the expanses of Finland and Karelia recording oral folk songs, the Kalevala is written in a distinctive meter, with each line featuring 4 pairs of stressed and unstressed syllables. It retold mythological tales, building a literary and cultural heritage that awakened Finnish nationalism in the 19th century. Oliver Twist. Charles Dickens. In his second novel, English writer Dickens paints a bold depiction of the social underclass of Victorian Britain, and of the poor fending for themselves in a hostile world. Seen as an early example of the social protest novel, Oliver Twist tells the story of Oliver as he flees the workhouse for London and joins a criminal child gang. Like many of Dickens' novels, it was published serially, with cliffhangers to keep readers hungry for each installment. A hero of our time. Mikhail Lermontov. In A Hero of Our Time, Russian writer, poet, and painter Lermontov introduces the protagonist Grigory Pechorin, an idle, nihilistic, superfluous man figure. Pechorin acts as an anti-hero through a series of adventures and love affairs set against the landscape of the Caucasus region of Russia. The author arranged his novel in 5 parts, portraying the complex nature of a sensitive, emotional, yet brutally cynical anti-hero who despairs at the pointlessness of life. I was ready to love the whole world, no one understood me, I learned to hate. A Hero of Our Time. Mikhail Lermontov. Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque. Edgar Allan Poe. Originally published in 2 volumes, Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque consists of 25 short stories or tales. Many of them are written with elements of Gothic form, and some delve into the darker psychological aspects of the protagonists' minds. U.S. writer Poe is regarded as the creator of dark romanticism, a specifically American form of romanticism. The Fall of the House of Usher, best known of the tales, sees Roderick Usher's home cracking and breaking and finally collapsing in sympathetic parallel with his own psychological breakdown. Much analysis of Poe's collection has centered on the meaning of the terms grotesque and arabesque. Whatever Poe's exact intention, the tales are significant for their treatment of terror and horror. There was an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. The Fall of the House of Usher. Edgar Allan Poe. The Black Sheep. Honoré de Balzac. Long overlooked but now considered to be one of the masterpieces of French novelist and playwright Balzac, The Black Sheep tells the story of the competing plots, manipulations, and schemes of the members of a bourgeois family to secure a substantial inheritance. Titled La Ribouilleuse, someone who stirs waters in order to trap fish, in French, in reference to a controlling mistress of the story, it is a compelling exploration of the nature of deceit. Money, status, and legitimacy, and the lengths to which human beings will go in order to secure financial reward are among the themes explored by Balzac. Honoré de Balzac. One of France's leading writers of the 19th century, Balzac is known for his development of realism in the novel form, especially in Old Goriot. Born in Tours in 1799, he moved to Paris as a child, attended the Sorbonne from 1816, and was heading towards law as a profession when he turned to writing. By 1832, he had plans for La Comédie Humaine, a collection of nearly 150 of his works, including essays, novels, and a range of analytical and philosophical texts. Balzac intended this vast compendium to capture the nature of the human condition, but he died in 1850, his life's work unfinished. Key works: 1829 The Chouans, 1834, 35 Old Goriot, 1841, 42 The Black Sheep. Dead Souls. Nikolai Gogol. Dead Souls is often seen as the first great novel of the Russian Golden Age. Inspired by his friend, the poet Pushkin, Ukraine-born writer Gogol intended to write a 3-part epic, but only produced the first 2 parts, and burned the manuscript of the 2nd volume when close to his death. The remaining novel satirizes the practices of serfdom in Russia. Since tax must be paid by landowners on all their serfs, even those who have died since the last census, lead character Chichikov colludes illegally with estate owners to buy their dead serfs. He plans to borrow money against the value of his dead souls to start his own estate. Chichikov's travels across Russia are a comic tale reminiscent of Cervantes' Don Quixote. Nikolai Gogol. Born in 1809 in Sorokinsky in the Russian Empire, Gogol was the progenitor of the great 19th-century tradition of Russian realism. Raised in the Cossack heartlands and shaped by the folklore of his native people, Gogol's early works displayed a lively and often colloquial style, winning instant acclaim from the Russian literary public. His short stories, novels, and plays spanned romanticism, surrealism, comedy, and satire, but his creative capacity waned in the years before his death in 1852. Key works: 1831, 32 Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka. 1836 The Government Inspector. 1842 Dead Souls. The Count of Monte Cristo. Alexandre Dumas. The most popular book throughout Europe at the time of its serialization, The Count of Monte Cristo, by French playwright and novelist Dumas, was set during the Bourbon Restoration. It tells the story of the revenge inflicted by Edmond Dantes on his enemies, following his imprisonment on false charges of treason. In prison he meets Abbé Faria, who tells him of hidden treasure on the island of Monte Cristo. After escaping and finding the treasure, Dantes rises again as the Count of Monte Cristo. Vanity Fair. William Makepeace Thackeray. Vanity Fair follows the fortunes of two women, Amelia Smedley, from a decent family, and the orphan Becky Sharp, as they head out into a swirling social world seeking wealth and standing. They are polar opposites. Amelia is innocent and gentle, while Becky is ferocious in her ambition to climb the social strata. English author Thackeray paints a vivid parody of society and creates an essentially amoral heroine in the impish Becky. Vanity Fair is a very vain, wicked, foolish place. Vanity Fair. William Makepeace Thackeray. David Copperfield. Charles Dickens. Describing the coming of age of the title character, David Copperfield was first published in serial form, and of all the novels of Dickens, it is the one closest to an autobiographical work. The details of Copperfield's life show parallels with the author's own, although places and settings were altered. Characters such as Great Aunt Betsy Trotwood, the obsequious Uriah Heep, and penniless Mr. Micawber are among Dickens' best-known and best-loved creations. The Scarlet Letter. Nathaniel Hawthorne. Set amid the Puritan world of mid-17th century Massachusetts, Hawthorne's historical romance tells the tale of Hester Prynne, a young woman found guilty of adultery and forced to wear a scarlet letter to signify her crime. Her husband has long disappeared, and is presumed dead. She defiantly refuses to name the father of her daughter, Pearl, against the demands of her public trial and her church minister, so is sent to prison. Hester's alienation from the strict religious creeds of Puritan society allows U.S. writer Hawthorne to explore wider spiritual and moral issues, such as attitudes to the notion of sin. The Scarlet Letter was an immediate success, becoming one of the first mass-produced books in American history. Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe. The hugely successful anti-slavery tale by U.S. writer Stowe helped to persuade readers that Christian beliefs and slavery were incompatible. Uncle Tom's Cabin tells of noble slave Tom, who is sold and forced to leave his wife and family, yet never loses his moral values. In its first year of publication, Stowe's story sold some 300,000 copies in the USA, highlighting the country's race issue and North-South division. It was even seen by some as a spark for the U.S. Civil War. North and South. Elizabeth Gaskell. English novelist Gaskell despised social inequality and poverty. Her tale of heroine Margaret Hale's journey from prosperous southern England to the north allowed readers to see the dire state of the lowest classes in Britain's industrial northern cities. The work graphically depicts the division between the north and south of England and the lives of those who provided the labor for the Industrial Revolution. It was published serially just after Hard Times by Dickens, at whose request Gaskell wrote her novel. Elizabeth Gaskell. Born in London in 1810, Gaskell was the daughter of a Unitarian minister. Married to a church minister in industrial Manchester, she began writing in her 30s after beginning a diary to record the day-to-day life of her family. Her first books drew on her early life in rural Cheshire, but it was her later novels, set amid the poverty and strife of the working class, that made her name. She died in 1865, her finest work, Wives and Daughters, unfinished. Key works: 1848 Mary Barton, 1853 Cranford. 1854, 55 North and South. Introduction. By the mid-19th century, the novel was firmly established as the predominant form of literature, with an unprecedented number of readers creating demand for new fiction across the world. No longer restricted to a cultural elite, reading had become a popular pastime, and readers increasingly sought books that were relevant to their own experiences and the world they lived in. Realism gains momentum. The portrayal of believable characters and stories had been pioneered by the earliest novelists, such as Daniel Defoe and Henry Fielding, and in the 19th century the trend towards ever greater authenticity continued, resulting in contemporary fiction about ordinary people and their everyday lives. This literary approach, known as realism, began in earnest in France, where a generation of writers, uncomfortable with the tendency of romanticism towards idealization and dramatization, sought to depict familiar scenes and characters as accurately as possible. One of the first to embrace the style was Honoré Balzac, whose monumental series of stories La Comédie Humaine was intended to provide an encyclopedic portrait of society, revealing the principles governing individual lives and their effects. This grand vision inspired not only French realist novelists such as Gustave Flaubert, but also a literary genre that spread across the Western world. By the latter half of the 19th century, elements of realism, and in particular the depiction of human preoccupations and fallibilities, could be found in novels from as far apart as Russia, Britain, and the USA. Authors enhanced the realism of their novels by various means. Some used the roman à clef, presenting historical events as fiction, others wrote from an omniscient narrator's perspective, enabling them to describe the thoughts and feelings, as well as the actions, of the characters. This emphasis on internal characterization developed into psychological realism, a subgenre that Russian authors in particular adopted, including Leo Tolstoy and Fyodor Dostoevsky. Social protest. In their striving for authenticity, many writers turned their attention to the lives of working people rather than the middle classes. In contrast to the depiction of the humdrum existence of a character like Madame Bovary, Victor Hugo and Charles Dickens showed in graphic detail the grim conditions of the peasantry and industrial working class, not only for literary effect, but also as a form of social and political commentary. Others, including Émile Zola, emphasized the role that social conditions play in shaping character. From Gothic to fantasy. The focus on the harsh, squalid realities of working-class life contributed to a gradual shift in perspective towards the dark side of city life. One result was the development of the Gothic tradition that became known as urban Gothic, epitomized by Bram Stoker's Dracula and Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The hope that this distressing era of dirt, disease, and death might be transformed for the better by advances in science enthralled the public and inspired authors such as Jules Verne and Arthur Conan Doyle to write scientific romances. These precursors of science fiction had plots that featured invented discoveries and technologies, presented as if they were real. A taste for the fantastical was also a prominent feature in the growing number of children's books that appeared at this time, notably in the nonsense fantasy of Lewis Carroll's surreal Alice novels. This strange, adventurous material began a golden age of children's literature, which included perennial favorites, such as Rudyard Kipling's collection of fables The Jungle Book and the more down-to-earth yarn of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Symbolist expression. Some writers argued that art should represent beauty and depict sensual pleasure rather than suffering. Writers of this aesthetic movement used an indirect style influenced by the symbolism of French poets such as Charles Baudelaire and Stéphane Mallarmé. The symbolists had reacted against what they saw as the prosaic description of realist novels, instead emphasizing the importance of metaphor, imagery, and suggestion. Symbolist poets also explored new means of expression, experimenting with poetic techniques, which were later to inspire the coming generation of modernist writers. In context. Focus French realism. Before 1830, with its detailed analysis of French society and psychological depth, Stendhal's The Red and the Black marks a definitive shift from Romanticism to realism. 1830, 56. The interlocking novels and stories of Honoré de Balzac's monumental La Comédie Humaine provide a panoramic view of French society from 1815 to 1848. After 1869, Flaubert's A Sentimental Education adds to the body of French realism with its vast presentation of France under Louis Philippe. 1885, Guy de Maupassant portrays the rise to power of a ruthless social climber in Belle Amie, a realist novel set in fin de siècle Paris. Romanticism, with its focus on emotion, nature, and the heroic, dominated French literature from the end of the 18th century, but by the 1830s a new literary genre was gathering force, realism. Although the genre went on to spread throughout Europe and beyond, its beginnings and its development are particularly associated with France. Emerging partly as a reaction to Romanticism, and reflecting the evolution of science and the social sciences, this new genre sought to depict contemporary life and society with detail and precision, in an unadorned and unromantic way. Realist writers put familiar situations and events under the literary microscope, representing them realistically rather than idealistically, even if some of the subject matter might have been considered banal when compared with the Romantics. Realism gathers force. One of the first French novelists of the period to take this approach was Stendhal, who incorporated both Romanticism and realism in his novels The Red and the Black and the Charterhouse of Parma. Honoré de Balzac was a key pioneer of French realism, creating a keenly observed and realistic portrayal of ordinary life in his masterpiece, La Comédie Humaine, which incorporated a vast series of more than 100 novels and stories. However, Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary moved much further along the path of realistic depiction, and it is considered to be the finest and most influential example of French realism. On the surface, Madame Bovary has a fairly simple plot. A young woman, Emma Bovary, is unhappily married to a rather dull doctor in provincial Normandy, in northern France. Influenced by the romantic reading of her youth, she dreams of a more exciting and fulfilling life, but her attempts to force reality to live up to her fantasies have devastating results. Her heart was just like that, contact with the rich had left it smeared with something that would never fade away. Madame Bovary. Life in the Provinces. The novel is more complex than the outline of its plot would suggest. From its beginning, when the reader is introduced to the young Charles Bovary, to its tragic ending, which supposedly had Flaubert himself in tears, Madame Bovary is deeply rooted in mid-19th century provincial France. Events in the wider world were moving fast, and for the newly emerging middle classes, the center of sophistication was Paris. But Flaubert chose to focus on the petit bourgeois in the provinces, whose lives he portrayed with an acute, and not always kindly, psychological perception. Flaubert had begun his literary career as a romantic, working on an exotic and mystical novel, The Temptation of Saint Anthony. However, some of his close friends, particularly his mentor, author Louis Boulhay, reacted critically to an early draft of this work and urged him to attempt something more realistic. Drawing on a real-life event, Flaubert began work on his new book. His aim was to write about the lives of ordinary people. Rouen, the capital of Normandy, is the provincial setting of Flaubert's text, a perfect backdrop for his skillful rendering of the lives and preoccupations of the middle class. There was no fire in the fireplace, the clock was still ticking, and Emma felt vaguely amazed that all those things should be so calm when there was such turmoil inside her. Madame Bovary. Creativity in detail. The project took Flaubert 5 years and involved meticulous research. He set his novel in the region around Rouen, where he spent most of his life and which he knew in intimate detail, he modeled places in his novel, the villages of Tostes and Yonville, on real country towns. He walked around the region and even made maps to ensure the greatest accuracy. He drew up biographies of his fictional characters, and set out to create a prose style that was totally stripped of all romanticism, laboring over every sentence. Sitting in his room by the river Seine at Croisset, near Rouen, he constantly corrected and rewrote every page of his manuscript, a time-consuming process. His aim was to write in an entirely new and objective fashion, without a single subjective reaction, nor a single reflection by the author. The result, as Flaubert had hoped, was a tour de force. Divided into 3 sections, Madame Bovary contrasts the hopelessness of sentimental romanticism with the monotonous reality of everyday life. In particular, Flaubert criticizes the foolishness and dullness of the middle classes, whom he held in contempt, even though he was himself middle class. Emma Bovary, around whom the novel rotates, symbolizes unrealistic romanticism. She is the convent-educated daughter of a wealthy farmer. Fed by the romances of Walter Scott and the meanderings of Lamartine, a romantic poet scorned by Flaubert, she dreams of living in some old manor house. Looking out far across the fields for the white-plumed rider galloping towards her on his black horse. Passion and reality. Seeking a marvelous passion, Emma marries Charles Bovary, a kindly but boring doctor in the small rural village of Tostes. Almost immediately she is disappointed, not just by Charles's dullness and lack of ambition, but also sexually. The disparity between her dreams and the unstimulating reality of her marriage, so perceptively described by Flaubert, lies at the heart of the novel. Emma and Charles move to Yonville, a provincial town that Flaubert portrays in painstaking and often ironic detail, describing it as a bastard region where the language is without accentuation, as the landscape is without character. Flaubert's ability to capture the mundane and commonplace contributed to establishing the novel as a key work in French realism. No detail is too small to be included. He describes roof thatches like fir caps, sickly pear trees, ancient farmhouses and barns, and small graveyards typical of the region. His description of the country fair where local dignitaries make pompous speeches, aping the urban middle classes, is masterly. Dramatically, he counterpoises the tedious speeches against the passionate conversations and actions of Emma Bovary, behind a window overlooking the fair. Flaubert dissects Madame Bovary in this 1869 caricature. The novel is a dissection of Emma's inner mind, exploring her private thoughts with an intense psychological realism. She wanted equally to die and to live in Paris. Madame Bovary. Unattainable dreams. Flaubert introduces other characters who live in Yonville, among them the town pharmacist, Monsieur Hamas, an atheist and self-opinionated individual who practices medicine without a license and uses every opportunity to display his apparent knowledge. In the most pompous manner, and Monsieur Larose, a merchant, who callously encourages Emma to run up debts, as she seeks to overcome marital boredom with what would today be described as retail therapy. Flaubert knew such characters very well and portrays them in intimate and realistic detail. Throughout the novel he brilliantly captures their dullness and their small-minded attitudes, while never allowing his writing to become dull. Just as Flaubert gently mocks Emma's completely unachievable dreams and romanticism, so he also mocks the unsympathetic and pretentious aspirations of the merchant class. Set among the realistic details of everyday routine, Flaubert's descriptions of Emma's romantic hopes and her frustrations within her provincial marriage are even more powerful, and appear surprisingly modern. Almost inevitably, Emma seeks romance and grand passion outside her marriage, embarking on 2 doomed affairs, first with the wealthy landowner and womanizer Rodolphe Boulanger, and then with Léon Dupois, a young law student, who shares her yearnings for glorious landscapes, music, and romantic literature. Although initially excited and apparently fulfilled, Emma ultimately becomes disillusioned. As Flaubert writes, adultery, Emma was discovering, could be as banal as marriage. Abandoned by one lover and rejected by the other, she spirals into a self-destructive path of increasing debt and alienation. Never touch your idols, the gilding will stick to your fingers. Madame Bovary. Realism on trial. Madame Bovary first appeared in serial form in the Revue de Paris. Almost immediately, Flaubert, the printer, and the manager of the review were brought to trial on charges of obscenity, and there was an attempt to ban the novel on the grounds of outrage against public and religious morality. It was not only its content but also the realism of the style itself that was considered vulgar and shocking. But Flaubert and his colleagues were acquitted, and although the novel initially received a mixed reception, it went on to become a bestseller. Madame Bovary and Flaubert's subsequent novel, Sentimental Education, with their objective, detailed, and stark portrayal of everyday life, marked the coming of age of French realism and at the same time its highest point. Within France, Flaubert's work influenced other major writers, including Guy de Maupassant, whose economical style and approach reflected the realism of his mentor, and Émile Zola, who, in novels such as Germinal, focused on the harsh realities of day-to-day life, and who, like Flaubert, often spent months researching his subject matter. Rodolphe Boulanger, Emma's first lover, recognizes her boredom, her frustrated passion, and her willingness to be seduced, and manipulates her expertly into an affair. Gustave Flaubert. Gustave Flaubert was born in Rouen, France, on December 12, 1821. His father was chief surgeon at the main hospital in Rouen. Flaubert began writing while still at school, but in 1841 he went to Paris to study law. At age 22 he developed a nervous disorder, and he left the law to devote himself to writing. In 1846 his father and his sister Caroline died. With his mother and niece, Flaubert moved to Croisset, near Rouen, where he lived for the rest of his life. He never married, but between 1846 and 1855 he carried on an affair with poet Louise Collet. Flaubert began to work on his novel Madame Bovary in 1851, completing it 5 years later. In 1857 he traveled to Tunisia, collecting material for his next novel, Salammbô, which was set in ancient Carthage. Other works would follow, but none ever achieved the acclaim of his first novel. Flaubert died on May 8, 1880 and was buried in Rouen Cemetery. Other key works: 1869 Sentimental Education, 1877 Three Tales. See also, The Red and the Black Old Goriot Germinal, A Sentimental Education, Lolita. In context. Focus. Indianism, Indianismo before 1609. Garcilaso Inca de la Vega, son of a Spanish conquistador and an Incan princess, writes Comentarios Reales de los Incas, a prose work about Incan traditions and customs, and Spain's conquest of Peru. 1851. Brazilian poet Goncalves Dias publishes one of the most famous poems of the Indianism movement, I Jucapirama, about a Tupi warrior. The title is in Tupi and means, he who must die that is worthy to be killed. 1856. A Confederação dos Tamoios is published. An epic poem about the Tupi people by Brazilian poet and playwright Goncalves de Magalhães. It was commissioned by Brazilian Emperor Pedro II. Indianism was a literary and artistic movement in mid-19th century Brazil, in which writers and artists showed the country's indigenous people, the Indians, in a heroic light. Two main factors contributed to Indianism. First, Brazil had only recently gained independence from Portugal, so authors were expressing the idea that their new nation was one in which tribes and Europeans were united and equal. The second factor was the arrival in Brazil of Romanticism from Europe, which cherished the indigenous people for their perceived innocence and spiritual purity. Romantic idealism. José de Alencar is regarded as the father of the Brazilian novel, and the Guarani first brought him to the attention of the public. Set in 1604, it tells the story of an early settler whose daughter, Cecilia, has a suitor but instead falls for Peri, the Guarani Indian of the book's title. Perry is an idealized creation, exotic yet noble, who abandons his tribe and approves of Christian teachings. Alan Carr's inclusion of native vocabulary, such as terms for flora and fauna, was seen as scandalous by the Portuguese literary establishment, but it freed Brazil's literature to develop in its own way. Highly romantic and lyrical, the Guarani is still taught in Brazilian schools today. They were brave, fearless men, uniting with the resources of civilized man, the cunning and agility of the Indian. The Guarani. See also, The Last of the Mohicans, the Gaucho Martín Fierro. In context. Focus. The French symbolists before 1852. Enamels and Cameos, a collection of poems by Théophile Gautier, departs from Romanticism, focusing on form rather than emotion. After 1865-66. Stéphane Mallarmé, in The Afternoon of a Faun, gives a dreamlike account of a faun conversing with two nymphs, one representing the material, one the intellectual. 1873. Arthur Rimbaud, in A Season in Hell, presents two sides to himself, the poet intoxicated by light and childhood and the down-to-earth peasant. 1874. Paul Verlaine brings out Songs Without Words, which is inspired by his relationship with Arthur Rimbaud. The work of the French symbolist poets of the 19th century focused on sensation and suggestion rather than plain description and rhetorical effects, and made use of symbols, metaphors, and imagery to evoke subjective moods. The leading symbolists included Paul Verlaine, Arthur Rimbaud, and Stéphane Mallarmé, but the pioneer was Charles Baudelaire. Art from Decay. In Les Fleurs du Mal, the title suggests the flowering of moral decay into art. Baudelaire turns his back on romantic outpourings in favor of suggestive symbolism and frank expression. Using the traditional Alexandrine meter, in which lines of 12 syllables are divided into two parts by a pause, or caesura, he addresses non-traditional new subjects that were shocking at the time, such as prostitution, interracial sex, drink, and drugs. Baudelaire paints a pessimistic portrait of modern man, inflected with his personal concerns, including his ambitions as a poet. At the book's heart is ennui, the deadening of the soul, as well as an existential dread and fear of death. A search for meaning. In the opening section, a series of poems explores the role of the artist as visionary, martyr, performer, outcast, and fool. The poet tries to find meaning through sex, but initial excitement is followed by disenchantment, to which art offers some consolation. In the second section, Parisian Tableaus, which was added for a new edition of 1861, the poet roams the city as a flaneur, finding only reminders of his own misery. The old Paris is gone, the new street scene alienating. The following sections describe the poet's resulting flight to drink, sex, and even Satanism. The last poem, The Voyage, is a miniature odyssey tracing the travels of the soul to its final adventure, where at last there might be something new to experience. See also, The Picture of Dorian Gray, A Season in Hell, The Waste Land, The Outsider. In context. Focus. Social protest novel before 1794. English radical writer William Godwin deplores an unjust social system in The Adventures of Caleb Williams. 1845. English politician Benjamin Disraeli writes Sybil, or The Two Nations, which shows that England has two worlds, the rich and the poor. 1852. 65. English novelist Charles Dickens criticizes the poverty and greed of Victorian society in Bleak House, Little Dorrit, and Our Mutual Friend. After 1870s, 80s. French writer Émile Zola attacks urban poverty and the social system in novels such as L'Assommoir and Germinal. 1906. The Jungle, a novel by U.S. journalist Upton Sinclair about Chicago's meatpacking industry, shocks readers. An immense novel, Les Miserables, is comprised of 5 volumes, each of which is subdivided into books of several chapters. Victor Hugo's motivation was also vast, namely, to write a novel that protested the social conditions existing in France at that time. For him, as long as there was social condemnation, which creates hells on earth, books like this cannot be useless. Hugo was not the only writer to highlight injustice in an attempt to bring about social change. In England, his contemporary Charles Dickens was doing the same, while Elizabeth Gaskell's portrait of the poor in the industrialized north of the country, Mary Barton, contributed to England's mood of social reform. Meanwhile, in the USA, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin helped mobilize public opinion against slavery. Hugo's book features a huge cast of characters and a vast historical sweep, spanning as it does the era from 1815 to the June 1832 uprising in Paris. It is a panoramic novel that embraces themes of hardship, poverty, greed, bitterness, politics, compassion, love, and redemption. Les Miserables. Hell in Need of Humanity. The main story in Les Miserables focuses on Jean Valjean, released after spending 19 years in prison for the theft of some bread. Now a social outcast, he steals from a bishop, who covers for him and whose kindness sets him on a path towards redemption. Under a false name, Valjean starts a business, becomes wealthy, and adopts a young girl, Cosette, whose mother, Fantine, forced into prostitution by poverty, has died. Despite his efforts, Valjean is haunted by his criminal past, and he is relentlessly pursued by an implacable police inspector, Javert. Many other characters weave in and out of his story: Marius, an idealistic law student, who falls in love with Cosette, the Thénardiers, unscrupulous innkeepers, who mistreat Cosette, their neglected children, Gavroche and Éponine, who live on the streets, and many revolutionary students. All are caught up in a hellish society that Hugo vividly describes. From time to time Hugo digresses to write about related topics, or to present his opinions. He writes in detail about such subjects as the Battle of Waterloo, street urchins, Parisian architecture, the construction of the Paris sewers, and religious orders. Towards the end of the novel, Hugo moves away from the action at the barricades to reflect on the role of revolution in creating a better society, before returning to the story and its conclusion. Les Miserables was widely advertised before publication and caused a considerable stir. Several reviewers were critical, accusing Hugo of being either dangerously revolutionary or overly sentimental. However, the book was an instant success, not just in France but also in Britain and beyond. Although it did not directly bring about change, its historical sweep and powerful description of social injustice meant that, like all great protest novels, it provoked thought and helped to raise social consciousness. Les Miserables has a large cast of intertwining characters. Although a mix of social classes is depicted, those whose wretched lives are swallowed up in the labyrinth of Paris's underworld are the focus. At the heart of the book is the fate of Cosette, the orphan child of a prostitute. Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo, one of France's leading writers, was born in 1802 in Besançon, eastern France, the son of an officer in Napoleon's army. Raised in Paris and well educated, by the age of 20 he had published his first volume of verse. Hugo was a prodigious writer, producing some 20 volumes of poetry, 10 plays, 9 novels, as well as many essays. A liberal Republican and supporter of universal suffrage, he was also active politically. Following the revolutions of 1848 that shook Europe, he was elected to the National Assembly. He was, however, highly critical of the Second Empire of Louis Napoleon and went into exile in 1851 with his wife, Adèle, and his long-standing mistress, Juliette Drouet. Returning to Paris as a national hero in 1870, Hugo became a senator in the Third Republic. He died in 1885 and was buried in the Pantheon. Other key works: 1827 Cromwell, 1831 The Hunchback of Notre Dame, 1859-83 The Legend of the Ages. See also, Bleak House Oliver Twist Uncle Tom's Cabin War and Peace Germinal. In context. Focus. The invention of childhood before 1812. Swiss pastor Johann David Weiss's Swiss family Robinson focuses on 4 children who, with their parents, discover self-sufficiency on a desert island. 1863. The Hero of the Water Babies, by English author Charles Kingsley, is a young chimney sweep who learns moral lessons in a fantastic underwater realm. After 1883. Italian Carlo Collodi's The Adventures of Pinocchio, featuring a marionette, is a moral tale for children. 1894. Characters in English author Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book include Mowgli, a boy raised by wolves, and Rikki Tikki Tavi, a mongoose. The concept of childhood was really only invented in the 18th century, when the middle classes began to see the value of a child's innocence and play. For most of literary history, children were rarely mentioned, occasionally appearing in such works as Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Émile and William Wordsworth's The Prelude. In the 19th century, Charles Dickens sometimes placed children in the foreground of his stories, but only in books for adults. Most tales written for, as opposed to about, children were adaptations of adult stories, or morally didactic. In the early 19th century, the Brothers Grimm's illustrated folk tales, originally collected for adults, were criticized as being unsuitable for young people because of their sexual and violent content. Later editions were adapted to be more child-friendly. Hans Christian Andersen, who wrote his fairy tales specifically for children, caused an outcry by failing to include a moral. In Wonderland, the laws of both nature and society are turned on their heads, time and space behave unpredictably, animals talk, at tea parties and games, anything might happen. The child's sense of threat in an adult world is evoked through fantasy. A Golden Age. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, writing for children enjoyed a golden age, founded on increasing literacy, the growth of commercial publishing, and recognition of the imaginative potential of a child's world. Tom Brown's School Days, by English author Thomas Hughes, started the tradition of the school story. Another new genre was the coming-of-age tale, such as Louisa May Alcott's Little Women in the USA. Other classics include Johanna Spyri's Heidi, from Switzerland, and Scotsman J. M. Barrie's Peter Pan. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is one of the most influential books of this flowering. Regarded as the first masterpiece for children in English, its fantastical story is a marked departure from the prevailing realism of literature at the time. On a July day in 1862, Charles Dodgson, a young mathematics don, went rowing with a male friend and 3 young sisters on the Thames near Oxford, and told a story about a girl named Alice, which was also the name of one of his passengers, Alice Liddell, aged 10. So Alice's Adventures in Wonderland took shape, appearing as a handwritten book, and then as a publication under the pseudonym Lewis Carroll. A Surreal World. In the story, 7-year-old Alice falls down a rabbit hole and finds herself in a surreal universe. She negotiates alone a world of strange creatures, strange attitudes, strange happenings, and strange linguistic logic. This is the focus of the book and its principal theme. Part of the book's coherence comes from the fact that Alice herself entertains unorthodox logic. As she falls down the rabbit hole, she wonders if she is going to land in the antipathies, and imagines herself appearing ignorant when she has to ask whether she is in Australia or New Zealand. Her next observation shows Carol brilliantly inhabiting a child's ingenuousness. No, it'll never do to ask, perhaps I shall see it written up somewhere. Alice constantly wonders about who she is, what are the rules of this peculiar world, and how she is to regain normality, common issues of childhood. Her bewilderment at first focuses on her being the wrong size, either too big or too small to do as she wants. After she meets the caterpillar, a new anxiety arises, the challenge of being repeatedly, often rudely, contradicted. Towards the end, with the Queen's repeated plea for a beheading, the possibility of violence adds to the tension. The brusque, hookah-smoking caterpillar intensifies Alice's insecurity. She is so confused by Wonderland that she cannot even answer his question, "Who are you?" Escape from rules. The characters that Alice meets are mostly animals. Apart from Alice and her sister, who features before and after the adventure, the only human characters are the Mad Hatter and the Duchess, since the King and Queen of Hearts are playing cards. Parents do not make an appearance, nor is there any reference to them. Yet the inversions of everyday life that imprison Alice might also, at the same time, be seen as liberating by Victorian adults accustomed to convention. One of the attractions of nonsense is that it offers a playground for the imagination, and arguably for the satisfaction of subliminal needs, including occasional escape from social rules. Alice makes no reference at the end to having learned any lessons from her adventures. However, she does, in the course of the book, become more forthright, and by the time of the trial scene near the end she is capable of saying to the Queen that her perverse sense of justice is stuff and nonsense. Her final act, by which time she is child-sized again, is to insist that the playing cards are just that, inanimate things, whereupon they fly into the air. By force of character she has punctured the illusion. The coda, featuring Alice's older sister, is beautifully judged. It starts with her dreaming, after a fashion, since a fully fledged dream would be less subtle than this elusive mind state. First, she affectionately imagines Alice herself, then the weird characters Alice has been describing pass in front of her. Finally, she imagines Alice turning into a grown woman, but keeping the simple and loving heart of her childhood, and passing on the story of Wonderland to a new generation. Well, I've often seen a cat without a grin, thought Alice, but a grin without a cat. It's the most curious thing I ever saw in all my life. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. The Harry Potter Phenomenon. J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter novels, featuring the adventures of a young wizard, show how powerful children's writing can be. Rowling owes the phenomenal success of the books partly to her skillful mixing of genres, combining fantasy, coming-of-age, and school story, together with elements of the thriller and romance. Rowling has stated that death is a major theme in the books, but this does not prevent them from containing a strong vein of humor. The publication schedule of the series allowed Harry to grow up in real time, so that the first generation of young Harry Potter readers literally grew up along with him, making their experience of reading the books particularly powerful. Immensely popular with children and also garnering a substantial adult readership, the books have generated great wealth for their author. More than 450 million of the 7 books had been sold by 2013. The meaning of nonsense. Fantasy conveyed with as much vividness, wit, and sensitivity as Carol's has immediate impact but will raise questions about hidden meanings. Food in the book often triggers unease. Did Carol suffer from an eating disorder? Since the brand of mathematics he taught at Oxford was conservative, at a time when more abstract ideas were taking root, some of the weird logic may be a satirical sidesweep at the new maths. And as the book was a gift for the real Alice, it may contain private references for her. For Harry Potter, mortality lurks in the shadows. He is a hero fighting the forces of darkness, and learning life lessons in the process. Carol's sources of inspiration will never be comprehensively recovered, yet any in-jokes in no way diminish the universality of Alice's adventures, grounded as it is in the vulnerability of children, a theme as relevant today as it was in Carol's time. Carol brought out a second and similar book about Alice in 1871, Through the Looking-Glass, and What Alice Found There. Here too are memorable characters, nonsensical songs, and witty aphorisms that flirt with alternative logic. As in Wonderland, meaning is slippery. A word, claims Humpty Dumpty, means just what I choose it to mean. However, the sequel is more menacing than the first Alice story, perhaps reflecting Carol's grief over the loss of his father. The lure of fantasy. A line of influence stretches from the magical transformations of Wonderland through J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit and C.S. Lewis's Narnia series, the whimsical rhyming world of Dr. Seuss, Roald Dahl's beloved Charlie in the Chocolate Factory, and J.K. Rowling's wizard stronghold Hogwarts. Although in the 21st century a new realism has entered writing for children, with stories of abandonment, homelessness, and alienation, fantasy remains perennially compelling to young minds. Humpty Dumpty, in common with characters in Wonderland, has conversations with Alice that are characterized by riddles, wordplay, and perverse logic posed as rationality. Lewis Carroll. Born in 1832 in Cheshire, England, Charles Dodgson was the son of a clergyman. He took a first-class degree in mathematics from Christ Church, Oxford, and from 1855 he held a lectureship there until his death. He was also ordained as a deacon. His first published work, in 1856, was a poem on solitude. Dodgson was well connected, his friends including the critic and writer John Ruskin, and the painter and poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti. He was a notable photographer, taking portraits of the poet Alfred Tennyson, the actress Ellen Terry, and many children. He died in 1898, aged 65, as a result of pneumonia after a severe dose of influenza. By this time Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was the most popular children's book in Britain. Queen Victoria was one of its admirers. Other key works: 1871 Through the Looking-Glass, and What Alice Found There. 1876 The Hunting of the Snark. See also, Robinson Crusoe, Gulliver's Travels, Children's and Household Tales, Fairy Tales, Little Women, Treasure Island. In context. Focus. Psychological realism before. See point 1012 Murasaki Shikibu's The Tale of Genji offers psychological insights into the lives of its characters. 1740 English writer Samuel Richardson's sentimental novel Pamela explores the inner nature of the novel's heroine. 1830 The Red and the Black, by French author Stendhal, is published and is seen by many as the first psychological realist novel. After 1871-72 George Eliot's Middlemarch traces the psychological landscape of a provincial English town. 1881 The Portrait of a Lady, by U.S. author Henry James, delves into the consciousness of the character Isabel Archer. Psychological realism is the depiction in literature of the personality traits and innermost feelings of a character, casting a spotlight on their conscious thoughts and unconscious motivations. The plot itself often takes a secondary role in works that focus on psychological realism, and is there to set out the relationships, conflicts, and physical settings within which these mental dramas are played out. Delving into the psyche of a character in this way marked a radical departure from romantic fiction, in which plotlines typically saw wrongdoing punished and virtue rewarded. Literary works had, however, long explored the workings of the human mind, though uninformed by the emerging science of psychology. For example, mental machinations are central in the 11th century Japanese story The Tale of Genji. In William Shakespeare's Hamlet, it is the inner conflicts of the hero that drive the drama, and the 18th century saw the heyday of the genre known as the epistolary novel, in which personal letters and journal entries were used to give the reader an insight into a character's intimate thoughts and feelings. All is in a man's hands and he lets it all slip from cowardice. Crime and Punishment. Exposing Minds. In his masterpiece Crime and Punishment, Fyodor Dostoevsky introduces the reader to his anti-hero, the student Rod Ion Romanovich Raskolnikov, also called Rodia or Rodka by the few people who love him. The author dissects, by means of a third-person narrative, Raskolnikov's psychological motivations in a way that presages the work of Sigmund Freud and other psychoanalysts. It is precisely this opening up of the protagonist's mind to the reader that secured the book's status as one of the most important and influential literary works to emerge in the 19th century. Crime and Punishment opens on a hot evening early in July in St. Petersburg, Russia. Raskolnikov, a shabbily dressed young man, steps from his tiny, garret flat, skips past his landlady, and slips away into the heat and the stench of the city. He is ill and also suffering from some form of mental dislocation. He mutters to himself. He is hungry. He walks the streets, disturbed by the presence of others. The reader is drawn ever closer to his innermost thoughts, fears, and anxieties. Raskolnikov is poor, and this motif of poverty is pervasive in the text. The reader wanders with him, seeing with his eyes a city that is striving to survive, a place in which many struggle against hunger and mental torment. Summertime in St. Petersburg is the setting for crime and punishment. The crowded, stifling conditions in the city mirror the troubled student Raskolnikov's feverish inner drama. Inner conflicts. Dostoevsky inserts a variety of colorful and brilliantly observed characters into the narrative, as seen through Raskolnikov's eyes. He ventures to the house of Alyona Ivanovna, a local pawnbroker, a diminutive, withered-up old woman of 60, with sharp malignant eyes and a sharp little nose. Raskolnikov has come to pawn his father's watch and, poverty-stricken, he is forced to accept a pitiful sum for it. As he leaves the apartment block, a thought enters his mind. He stops on the stairs, shocked at himself, and once back on the crowded streets, he walks as though in a dream, regardless of the passers-by, and jostling against them, until he finds himself by a flight of steps leading down into a tavern. Although he has never been into a tavern before, he enters and orders a beer, and immediately, he felt easier, and his thoughts became clear. But Dostoevsky informs the reader that Raskolnikov is far from well, because, even at that moment he had a dim foreboding that this happier frame of mind was also not normal. He has a conversation with a drunken man, Marmeladov, who tells a pitiful story of poverty and his daughter's prostitution, both brought about by his alcoholism. Marmeladov acknowledges his vice and reveals that he is confessing this to Raskolnikov, a chance encounter, rather than the regular patrons, because in his face he can read some trouble of mind. Raskolnikov finally returns to his own hovel where he broods all the following day. Dostoevsky paints a desperate picture of destitution and Raskolnikov's isolation from society. The author's mastery of psychological realism fully exposes Raskolnikov's inner deliberations and machinations over how to act on his thought, which is to commit a crime. And he draws the reader tangibly and empathetically close to Raskolnikov's mind, the mind of a murderer. We feel his terror, and we experience the dirty streets and depraved citizens of St. Petersburg through his eyes. We become witnesses as scenes are played out in his mind, and we lie beside him in his squalid home. We, too, start to feel the awful sense of the inevitability of the act, from its imagined conception through to its grim and bloody reality. Just as Freud would later argue that dreams enable understanding of waking experience, Dostoevsky offers insights into his antihero's mind through his dreams. In one dream, Raskolnikov witnesses drunken peasants beating a horse to death. Heavy with symbolism, the dream foreshadows the crime he is about to commit, but it is also a reference to his desensitization to atrocity, and to the loss of his free will to act. Much later, he dreams that microscopic bugs cause insanity, dissent, and a propensity to violence in humans, an allusion to Raskolnikov's state of mind. Only to live and live. Life, whatever it may be. Crime and punishment. Raskolnikov recalls dreams he had while delirious in hospital. In one a plague of microbes had infected people and driven them mad, all convinced that they alone had the truth. The shock of violence. The murder of Alyona Ivanovna is portrayed with a powerfully visceral actuality. Raskolnikov clubs the old woman with an axe until her skull is broken and even battered in on one side. Over the floor lies a perfect pool of blood. The moments hang in chillingly real tension as Raskolnikov unlocks a wooden chest under the bed and retrieves the riches of bracelets, chains, earrings, pins. And the scene is not complete. There are further footsteps in the room where Alyona Ivanovna lies. Suddenly, he jumped up, seized the axe and ran out of the bedroom. So ends the first part of the novel. Dostoevsky presents several potential motives for this crime, the most prominent of which is Raskolnikov's perception of himself as a Superman, someone superior to others, above the law, who feels a disgust for society and the mindless behavior of the herds of ordinary people. At one point, Raskolnikov remarks that all great men have been criminals, transgressing ancient laws and shedding blood if it were of use to their cause. Dostoevsky's exposition of this motive is thought to reflect his anguish at the changes he observed in Russian society, the rise of materialism, the decline of the old order, and the popularity of selfish and nihilistic philosophies. Raskolnikov's crime, and his later unraveling, serve as a caution to those of Dostoevsky's compatriots inclined to revolutionary change. The really great men must, I think, have great sadness on earth. Crime and punishment. Guilt and redemption. In the unfolding consequences of the murder, we follow Raskolnikov around the streets of St. Petersburg in his desperation and fevered delirium. He stumbles upon the drunk, dying Marmeladov who has been run over by a carriage and horses, and is drawn closer to Marmeladov's daughter, Sonia, who is left to support the family alone. Raskolnikov meets Porfiry Petrovich, a detective who becomes increasingly convinced that Raskolnikov is guilty of the crime, but lacks the evidence to prove it. Raskolnikov's nerves are in shreds. Would confessing and taking the punishment of the law be preferable to the torture of his own conscience? Does his sense of remorse suggest that he is ordinary rather than extraordinary? Tsar Alexander II abolished serfdom in Russia in 1861. The prostitutes found around St. Petersburg's seedy Haymarket area, a regular haunt of Raskolnikov, were predominantly desperate peasant girls. Representing reality. In Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky masterfully explores and dissects the immensely complex nature of the mind of his protagonist. The novel's powerful exploration of the meaning of life and the existence in the world of horror, evil, suffering, and brutality is matched by its examination of guilt, conscience, love, compassion, relations with our fellow humans, and the possibilities of redemption. Dostoevsky's concern for representing the reality of the psychological processes in Raskolnikov's mind ensured that Crime and Punishment became a significant touchstone for future novelists. This approach to writing coincided with, and was arguably influenced by, the rise of the science and practice of psychology. One of the late 19th century's most psychologically attuned writers, novelist Henry James, was brother of the pioneering psychologist William. The existential writers of the mid-20th century, including Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, also owe much to the groundbreaking narrative form created by Dostoevsky. Raskolnikov's motives for killing Alyona Ivanovna are a central theme of Crime and Punishment. Dostoevsky shows that his antihero's actions are prompted by a complex interplay of motives, internal dialogues, and unconscious drives that combine social, individual, philosophical, and religious imperatives. 100 suspicions don't make a proof. Crime and Punishment. Fyodor Dostoevsky. Fyodor Dostoevsky was born in Moscow, Russia, in 1821 to parents of Lithuanian descent. He trained and worked as an engineer before writing his first novel, Poor Folk, which depicts the mental as well as the material condition of poverty. In 1849, Dostoevsky was arrested for being a member of the Petrushevsky Circle, a socialist intellectual group. After the torment of a mock execution by firing squad, he endured several years of hard labor in Siberia, where he began to suffer from epilepsy. After his release, issues with creditors prompted his voluntary exile in Western Europe. After the death of his first wife, in 1867 he wed Anna Grigoryevna Snitkina, who gave birth to their 4 children, acted as his secretary, and managed the family's finances. Haunted by infirmity, he died in 1881. Other key works. 1864 Notes from the Underground, 1866 The Gambler, 1869 The Idiot, 1880 The Brothers Karamazov. See also, The Tale of Genji the Princess of Cleves, Madame Bovary, Middlemarch, The Portrait of a Lady. In context. Focus. Russia's Golden Age before 1831, 32 The publication of Nikolai Gogol's Evenings on a Farm near the Dykanka and Alexander Pushkin's Tales of Belkin's Signal Developments in Russian Literature Away from the Folkloric Forms of the Past. 1866 Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment brings the science of psychology into literary realism to explore human motivation. After 1880 Fyodor Dostoevsky's novel The Brothers Karamazov is published, the last great novel of Russia's Golden Age. 1898 Moscow Art Theatre stages The Seagull, which establishes Anton Chekhov as the preeminent dramatist of Russia's Golden Age. Russia in the 19th century was the seat of enormous creativity in prose, poetry, and drama. Critics have dubbed the period the country's Golden Age, not for any unity of intent among the authors, but for the sheer number of literary works of international significance that emerged there over a short time. The literature of the Golden Age was heavily influenced by the modernization of Russia in the 18th century. The country, which had been insulated by culture and geography from the Renaissance that affected the rest of Europe from the 14th to the 17th centuries, was rapidly westernized under Peter the Great, Tsar from 1682 to 1725. Peter oversaw the adoption of Western customs, learning, and even language, to the extent that, by the early 19th century, the primary tongue spoken by the Russian aristocracy was French. The traditional literature of Old Russia, notably the folk epic, was displaced by writing that focused on more modern themes, and the Russian language itself developed new literary forms that carried through to the 19th century. However, Russian writers did much more than ape the conventions of Western literature. They reacted to and defied its assumptions, and carved out their own uniquely Russian forms of expression, which often looked back to the themes of earlier folktales, and sometimes even challenged the very concept of writing as art. In the West, the writers of Russia's Golden Age were regarded with curiosity. They were certainly brilliant, but they were also considered savage and unschooled. The first flowering of the Golden Age early in the 19th century included works from writers such as Alexander Pushkin, Nikolai Gogol, and Ivan Turgenev. A second blossoming in the 1860s and 1870s produced the greatest works of the period, including Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, a visceral exercise in psychological realism, and Tolstoy's War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Within a single lifespan, Russian literature had made a series of incredible leaps from a folkloric tradition to far more complex and extensive literary styles. Tolstoy's expansive epic War and Peace explores Russian identity and history through the experiences of, and interactions between, members of 5 noble families, the Bezukhovs, the Bolkonskys, the Rostovs, the Kuragins, and the Drubetskoys. If no one fought except on his own conviction, there would be no wars. War and Peace. History writing. A typically Russian ambivalence about Western literary tropes led Tolstoy to write that there is not a single work of Russian artistic prose that quite fits the form of a novel, a poem, or a story. He was reluctant to categorize his masterful War and Peace not a novel, even less is it a poem, and still less a historical chronicle, he stated in 1868. Tolstoy's concern was that all historical records had their pitfalls and that the truth of history was hard to grasp without an omniscient view. He attempted to achieve such a wide perspective in War and Peace by exploring the experiences of a vast cast of characters, more than 500 in all, from across society. Some of the characters were inspired by people Tolstoy knew in real life. Natasha Rostova, for example, was based on Tolstoy's wife's sister. Many of the aristocratic characters were given authentic, but slightly bastardized names. The name of reckless and willful Bezukhov, for example, translates as "fearless." War and Peace spans a period of 8 years from July 1805, narrating the events of Napoleon's invasion of Russia up to the eventual burning of Moscow in September 1812. The main narrative follows the rise and fall in the fortunes of 5 fictional, aristocratic Russian families set against the backdrop of the Napoleonic Wars of the 19th century, linking their personal lives to the history of Russia. Alongside these fictional characters, Tolstoy casts a series of actual historical figures, such as Tsar Alexander and Napoleon, as key players in his epic. High society balls of the early 19th century, where attendees dressed in military finery and expensive gowns, characterize Tolstoy's depiction of the shallow liberalism of St. Petersburg. Introductions. The book begins in the most westernized of Russian cities, St. Petersburg, at a high society soiree. While Napoleon's army marches through Italy and heads east, the city's aristocrats meet to gossip, gamble, drink, and flirt. Significantly, the opening lines of the book, spoken by the hostess of the soiree, Anna Pavlovna Scherer, establish the book's focus on history, war, and the state of European affairs. Well, Prince, so Genoa and Lucca are now just family estates of the Bonapartes. Tolstoy uses this gathering to introduce readers to some of his leading characters, including Prince Andrei Nikolaevich Bolkonsky, a handsome, intelligent and wealthy figure who will emerge as one of the heroes of the book, and Andrei's friend Pierre Bezukhov, the ungainly and bulky son of a Russian count, through whom Tolstoy relays his own thoughts and concerns on the best way to live a moral life in an immoral world. Tolstoy's narrative then moves to Moscow, where both the city and its people have more traditionally Russian qualities. Here, the reader is introduced to further characters, including Countess Rostova and her 4 children, one of whom is Natalia Ilyinichna. Black-eyed, wide-mouthed, and full of life, whose vibrant energy flits through the pages of the book. There's nothing stronger than those 2 old soldiers, time and patience. War and Peace. Russia at war. Soon, Russia is at war. Napoleon's forces march towards Moscow and are met by the Russians some 100 kilometers west of the city at the Battle of Borodino on September 7, 1812. Tolstoy paints a vivid image of the bloodbath in which more than 25,000 men were killed in a single day. He presents the thoughts and actions of real-life characters, such as Napoleon and his Russian counterpart Kutuzov, alongside those of imagined characters like Andrei and Pierre, allowing readers to see the chaos and brutal truth of war from every perspective. The battle, which was an indecisive victory for the French, marks the turning point of the war. While life for St. Petersburg's aristocrats continues almost unaffected, Moscow is sacked and burned by Napoleon's Grand Army before it retreats. Napoleon's forces suffer enormous hardships as they withdraw. Facing freezing conditions and starvation, they are slaughtered in their thousands by the Russians. In the book's 2-part epilogue, Tolstoy tells of life in 1813 and beyond, after Napoleon's army has fled and the war is over, with peace finally restored to Russia and her people. The Battle of Borodino is a key moment in Tolstoy's War and Peace. In his account, it is the chaos of battle, rather than the orders of leaders, which decide the conflict's outcome. The small actions of many. After finishing the stories of his fictional characters, Tolstoy reappraises the historical roles played by Napoleon and Tsar Alexander. He concludes that history is not driven by the actions of great leaders, but by many, small and ordinary events. History is the life of nations and of humanity. In War and Peace, that vast scale is finely observed, and Tolstoy's penetrating vision into everyday truths makes the book the vast, grand work that it is. War and Peace captured the essence of an era. In 1875, it was described by the Russian novelist Ivan Turgenev as the vast picture of the whole nation's life. A century on from its publication, Ernest Hemingway declared that it was from Tolstoy that he had learned to write about war, for no one wrote about war better than Tolstoy did. Nor indeed, have many written better on peace. Leo Tolstoy. Leo Tolstoy was born near Moscow in 1828 to a noble Russian family. After leaving Kazan University early, Tolstoy led a dissolute life in Moscow and St. Petersburg, running up significant gambling debts. He toured Europe in 1860-61, meeting the novelist Victor Hugo and the political thinker Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Both inspired Tolstoy to return to Russia to write and educate the impoverished serfs. In 1862, Tolstoy married Sofia Andreevna Bayers, with whom he had 13 children. Sofia looked after their financial matters, although their marriage became increasingly unhappy. After completing War and Peace and Anna Karenina, Tolstoy sought spiritual and moral truth through his Christianity and by espousing pacifism, influencing figures such as Gandhi and Martin Luther King. He died of pneumonia in 1910, aged 82. Other key works: 1875, 77 Anna Karenina, 1879 A Confession, 1886 The Death of Ivan Ilyich, 1893 The Kingdom of God is Within You. See also, Eugene Onegin, A Hero of Our Time, Dead Souls, Crime and Punishment, The Idiot Anna Karenina, The Brothers Karamazov, Uncle Vanya. In context. Focus. The omniscient narrator before. 1749 Henry Fielding's omniscient narrator in Tom Jones exposes the process of constructing a narrative. 1862 The omniscient voice in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables comments on politics, society, and the characters in the text. 1869 War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy includes an omniscient voice to enable philosophical discussion. After 1925 The omniscient narrator in Mrs. Dalloway lets Virginia Woolf create characters with great inner space and depth. 2001 Third-person omniscient narration by Jonathan Franzen, in The Corrections, suggests that cultural commentary and authority is a revived function of literary fiction. The omniscient narrator writes from a perspective outside the story but knows everything about the characters and events in the story. This authorial voice was widely used by 19th-century novelists in the context of social realism. Many of the best-known writers of the period, Charles Dickens, Victor Hugo, and Leo Tolstoy, for example, often wrote in the third-person omniscient, and the narrative device was ideal for George Eliot in Middlemarch, as it helped her to draw her readers into watching keenly the stealthy convergence of human lots. Through the intertwining storylines of a large cast of characters, who live in the provincial English town of the title, Middlemarch explores tensions between marriage and vocation. In particular, it focuses on the dreams of two idealistic individuals, the intelligent and philanthropic heiress Dorothea Brooke, and the talented but naive Dr. Tertius Lydgate. A world of hard choices. Eliot steers clear of conformist happy endings, a fantasy that she considered the territory of silly lady novelists. Her ambition was to create a portrait of the complexity of ordinary human life, minor flaws and failings, small tragedies, quiet triumphs, and moments of dignity. It is the omniscient voice that regularly turns our focus back to this ambition. Eliot admired the German writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and also shared his philosophy that the efforts of each single individual are essential to the overall progress of humankind. In Middlemarch she refines and fictionalizes this tenet, proposing that women play a unique and significant role in the trajectory of progress and change. In particular, Eliot poses the question of how to do this as a woman in the real and changing world. An invitation to think. There are many discussions about the role of women, between the novel's characters, as well as in the authorial asides. Male characters describe a range of qualities that are expected of women, from Dorothea's husband Mr. Casaubon's ideal of self-sacrificing affection to Lydgate's daydream of beautiful companionship, reclining in a paradise with sweet laughs for bird notes. Yet there is a reluctance to promote a single, conclusive opinion regarding women's lot in society. Instead, the authorial voice invites us to reach our own conclusions by posing questions such as, was point of view the only possible one with regard to this marriage? Although Eliot has been accused by critics of authorial bullying, Henry James read the novel as too clever by half. She succeeds in sustaining a discursive tone, particularly in interjections by the omniscient narrator. George Eliot remains faithful to her own conviction that we must concern ourselves with real-life issues by inviting readers to perceive their own interconnected web of complex and often opposing tendencies in all people, whether those people are fictional or real. What do we live for, if not to make life less difficult to each other. Middlemarch. George Eliot. George Eliot was born Marion Evans in 1819 in Warwickshire, England. Unusually for a girl, she was educated at private schools until the age of 16. After her mother died in 1836, she became housekeeper for her father. After his death, in 1849, Eliot traveled to Geneva, then London, where she settled and in 1851 became editor of John Bray's journal, the Westminster Review. She formed a number of unreciprocated attachments, including to philosopher Herbert Spencer, but found true love with fellow intellectual George Henry Lewes, who was separated but could not divorce. In 1854, they chose to live together openly, and Evans began writing her novels, using a male pseudonym to lend authority to her work. Her writing ended after Lewes died in 1878. In 1880 she married John Walter Cross, but died just 7 months later. Other key works. 1859 Adam Bede, 1860 The Mill on the Floss, 1861 Silas Marner, 1876 Daniel Deronda. See also, Pride and Prejudice, The Three Musketeers, Vanity Fair, Les Miserables, Crime and Punishment, War and Peace, Tess of the d'Urberville. In context. Focus. Scientific romance before 1818 Frankenstein, by the English author Mary Shelley, is published. It is often seen as the first fictional work with a scientific focus. 1845 The term scientific romance is used for the first time, in a review of the anonymously authored 1844 work Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, to describe its unorthodox scientific ideas as literary fiction. After 1895 The Time Machine, H. G. Wells's first science fiction novel, popularizes the concept of time travel and offers a dystopian view of the future. 1912 Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World extends the genre of scientific romance by envisioning dinosaurs in contemporary South America. The term scientific romance originated in the 19th century to describe speculative writings about natural history or to condemn scientific ideas as fanciful. But over time, as scientific knowledge meant that ideas about the future grew more plausible, the label came to be applied to fictional works that incorporated aspects of scientific wonder in the plotline. This was an era in which Europeans, now obsessed with technology, social progress, travel, and adventure, dominated the world, and it was hoped that science could help to transform an era of grime and squalor into one of comfort and wealth. Science and exploration. Frenchman Jules Verne is the best remembered of the 19th-century scientific romance writers, demonstrating in his works a prescient and imaginative taste for futuristic travel. Verne's travelogue 5 Weeks in a Balloon established his style of action-packed adventure, playing with the possibilities of exploration. From journeying into the air, Verne turned terrestrial with Journey to the Center of the Earth, but it was in the oceans that he achieved his greatest success in the genre. In the 1850s Verne began to develop the idea of an underwater boat, which became Nautilus, the ship of Captain Nemo in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Verne's narrative relates the fabulous tale of Nemo and his crew, of their spectacular submarine adventures finding kelp forests and giant squid in the watery regions of the world. The wonderfully creative Verne gave his travelers diving suits and air guns to use underwater, an amazing vision of the potential power of scientific development to enable exploration of the furthest reaches of the world. In the early 20th century, scientific romance was largely superseded by the term science fiction, and the focus shifted to outer space and the future rather than terra incognita. See also, Frankenstein. In context. Focus Roman à clef. Before 1642, 69 readers would have recognized depictions of important society figures in the Roman à clef novels of French writer Madeleine de Scudéry, such as Clélia. 1816 The characters in the scandalous novel Glenarvan, by the English aristocrat Lady Caroline Lamb, are thinly disguised versions of her ex-lover Lord Byron and others in her own privileged London social circle. After 1957 On the Road by Jack Kerouac continues the tradition of the Roman à 4, detailing his time traveling in North America. 1963 U.S. writer Sylvia Plath's semi-autobiographical The Bell Jar depicts a young woman's descent into mental illness. The Roman à 4, or novel with a key, is literature that depicts real people or events thinly disguised as fiction, the key being the relationship between the real and the fictitious. Such works often use satire and humor to comment on politics, scandals, and controversial figures. Deceit and corruption. The Red Room, a novel by Swedish author August Strindberg, who was also a much-admired playwright, is a satire of Stockholm society, akin to the work of English writer Charles Dickens in its biting critique. Considered to be the first modern Swedish novel in its style and content, the book introduces Arvid Falk, Strindberg's alter ego and a naive idealist. Falk is a young civil servant when we meet him, so frustrated by the bureaucracy and drudgery of his job that he gives it up to become a journalist and author. He encounters characters from theater, politics, and business, drawn from real personalities in the Stockholm elite, and, disheartened, he soon realizes that Swedish society is riddled with deceit and corruption. The title of the novel refers to a room in a Stockholm restaurant where bohemians gathered. Here, Falk seeks solace with artists and writers to contemplate the vicissitudes of life. The comic descriptions of the characters he encounters provide a sense of the tensions between bohemian and bourgeois life in Stockholm. Train yourself to regard the world from a bird's-eye view, and you will discover how petty and insignificant everything is. The Red Room. See also, Bleak House on the Road, The Bell Jar, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. In context. Focus. Transatlantic fiction before 1844. In Martin Chuzzlewit, Charles Dickens offers an early piece of transatlantic fiction, set in England and the USA. 1875. The Way We Live Now, a satirical novel by English writer Anthony Trollope, follows corrupt European financier Augustus Melmotte and his American investments. After 1907. U.S. author Edith Wharton's Madame de Treymes revolves around Americans living in France. 1926. In The Sun Also Rises, U.S. author Ernest Hemingway presents a group of young American and British expatriates in Paris and Spain. 1955. In Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, European Humbert Humbert pursues the young Lolita across the USA. Much has been made of the supposed psychological and cultural differences between Europeans and Americans, whether in language, humor, or social etiquette. In Europe, the debate often centers on Americanisms that are seen to be creeping into European cultures. Similar preoccupations have been reflected in literature, with early transatlantic fiction often exploring cultural differences, but with a particular focus on the impact of the Old World on U.S. sensibilities. Although the 18th century had seen a political and economic breach in Anglo-American relations that led to U.S. independence in 1776, there remained a strong, though at times antagonistic, bond between the two. As a nation, the USA gained in confidence, and saw a growth in the affluent classes and an increase in tourism and transatlantic travel. If we're not good Americans, we're certainly poor Europeans, we've no natural place here. The Portrait of a Lady. Innocents Abroad. One prominent example of an American with a taste for travel and an eye for cultural difference was the expatriate Henry James. He viewed his fellow Americans with detachment, and his novels examined in depth what it meant to be an American. Like so many of his works, The Portrait of a Lady depicts a cast of mainly American characters in a European setting. The self-made Caspar Goodwood is a symbol of his nation. Enterprising and forthright. He is contrasted with Gilbert Osmond, who has adopted European manners and values, a morally corrupt man who poses as an aesthete, a man of taste. It is through the novel's central character, Isabel Archer, that the tensions between Old and New World values are most starkly played out. Isabel is an intelligent, imaginative woman, who reflects the optimism and individualism of the USA. Traveling to England and then to Europe, Isabel, despite her independent spirit, also desires to conform to the social proprieties she encounters abroad. Her charm and sincerity make her attractive to suitors, but she believes marriage will curtail her freedom. To secure her independence, her cousin Ralph Touchett persuades his father to bequeath a large inheritance to Isabel, so that she will never have to marry for money. Ironically, her fortune renders her vulnerable to the seductions of sinister Gilbert Osmond, as Old World cunning ensnares New World innocence. James continued these themes in his later works, including The Ambassadors and The Wings of a Dove, and inspired several authors, such as Edith Wharton, to focus on similar concerns. Early transatlantic literature typically contrasted U.S. vulgarity and enthusiasm with European sophistication and cynicism. Europe remained hugely compelling and attractive to Americans, in both real life and fiction. Henry James. New York-born Henry James, the son of wealthy intellectual Henry James Sr., spent his childhood traveling across Europe. After returning to the USA to attend Harvard University, he decided he wanted to be a writer, and published his short stories and reviews in periodicals. From 1875 James settled in Europe, eventually moving to London. His nomadic childhood and life abroad as an adult allowed him to critique both American and European society. He was a prolific writer, producing short stories, plays, essays, travel sketches, and reviews as well as novels, and was nicknamed the Master by his friend Edith Wharton. In his writing, he remained very much an American, with his greatest characters being from his birth nation. In 1915 he became a British citizen. Other key works: 1879 Daisy Miller, 1886 The Bostonians, 1902 The Wings of a Dove, 1903 The Ambassadors, 1904 The Golden Bowl. See also, The Turn of the Screw, Lolita. In context. Focus American voices. Before 1823 The Pioneers, the first of James Fenimore Cooper's saga The Leatherstocking Tales, offers conflicting views of life on the frontier in one of the first original U.S. novels. 1852 Harriet Beecher Stowe creates multiple vernacular voices in Uncle Tom's Cabin, a sentimental story that inflames the anti-slavery debate. After 1896 In the Country of the Pointed Firs, Sarah Orne Jewett paints a vivid picture of life in an isolated fishing village on the coast of Maine. 1939 John Steinbeck's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel The Grapes of Wrath mixes local color with social injustice in an epic story of a family's journey west in the midst of the Great Depression. With little history to speak of and few literary traditions to anchor them, U.S. writers in the 19th century were engaged in holding up a mirror to the varied, complex populations of their rapidly evolving nation. One author blazed a trail, citing his story specifically in the Mississippi Valley in the Midwest with a poor white boy narrator like no other. Mark Twain's Huck Finn relates his adventures in regional dialect, salted with philosophical musings and homespun wisdom, and along the way becomes one of the first authentic voices in American literature. What is it about the adventures of Huckleberry Finn that led Ernest Hemingway to declare it to be the starting point for all American literature? For a start, it empowered generations of American writers to shift literature from its center in the New England colonies and cite their works on home soil with local color and vernacular speech. But what is also remarkable is the radical heart of this free-flowing, boys-own story. Twain's novel was published after the American Civil War, but is set 40 to 50 years earlier, when slaveholding persisted in the South and settlers were scrabbling for land in the West. Huck's ingenuous thoughts reflect the numerous contradictions at the heart of American society. The use of regional dialect in notable examples of 19th and early 20th century American literature gave a voice, and thereby a form of representation, to races, regions, cultures, and classes that had previously been denied one. Adventures Down the River. Early on in the narrative, Huck introduces himself to the reader as an established character from a previous novel by Twain, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which gives his account the credibility of social history. He feigns death to escape the civilizing folk of Missouri and the brutality of his father, and begins his journey down the Mississippi on a raft, in the company of Jim, a runaway slave. As they drift south, the barbarous reality of backwoods society encroaches whenever they make contact with the shore. In these one-horse towns, lynch mobs and gangs administer justice, tricksters play to the weakness of the crowd, loud-mouthed drunks are summarily shot, and a young gentleman who befriends Huck is murdered in a family feud. In a text that is peppered with the offensive word nigger, subversion is played out through the talks between Huck and Jim. Newly escaped from being sold down the river by his mistress, Jim concludes, "Yes, N.I.'s rich now. I owns myself, N.I.'s worth $800. I wished I had the money." Living on the raft in idyllic self-sufficiency, Huck and Jim are cast adrift from their social order, and a friendship develops. Later, as Huck wrestles with a Southern ideology that demands he should turn Jim in, he can remember the man only as a friend, we are floating along, talking, and singing, and laughing. Somehow I couldn't seem to strike no places to harden me against him. By the time Tom Sawyer, the eponymous hero of Twain's earlier novel, steps onto the page, Huck's emotional development is almost complete. Although it was condemned as coarse when it was first published in 1884, Huckleberry Finn injected American writing with a new energy, style, and color. Its focus on the speech of real Americans stretched on through the voices of John Steinbeck's dispossessed farmers in The Grapes of Wrath to recent first-person narratives such as Drown, Junot Diaz's stories of Dominican Americans in New Jersey. You feel mighty free and easy and comfortable on a raft. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Mark Twain. Born on November 30, 1835, Samuel Langhorne Clemens grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, which served as the model for St. Petersburg in Huckleberry Finn. After the death of his father, Clemens left school at the age of 12. He worked as a typesetter and occasional writer, and in 1857 became a steamboat pilot on the Mississippi. During the Civil War he prospected for silver in Nevada, then started writing for newspapers, adopting the pen name Mark Twain. In 1870 Clemens married Olivia Langdon. They settled in Connecticut and had 4 children. Despite the success of his novels, a series of poor investments bankrupted him, but from 1891 he lectured widely, enjoyed international celebrity, and restored his finances. As Mark Twain, he wrote 28 books, and many short stories, letters, and sketches. He died in 1910. Other key works. 1876 The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, 1881 The Prince and the Pauper. 1883 Life on the Mississippi. See also, Uncle Tom's Cabin, The Sound and the Fury of Mice and Men, The Grapes of Wrath, To Kill a Mockingbird. In context. Focus naturalism. Before. 1859 On the Origin of Species, by English naturalist Charles Darwin, has a profound impact on numerous literary works, encouraging a belief in physiological determinism. 1874 Thomas Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd, with its fatalistic portrayal of the inequitable condition of humankind, foreshadows French naturalism. After. 1891 English novelist George Gissing's New Grub Street looks at the damaging effect of poverty on creativity. 1895 Set during the American Civil War, Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage presents with psychological naturalism an inexperienced soldier's reactions to the bloodshed. Naturalism was a literary movement that evolved in mid-19th century France, in reaction to the sentimental imagination of Romanticism. Rather than depicting an idealized world, naturalism focused on the harsh lives of those in the lowest social strata. It had much in common with realism, which aimed to present an accurate evocation of ordinary life, as exemplified in Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary. Naturalism had similar literary ambitions and used detailed realism, but was rooted in the theory that humans are unable to transcend the impact of their environment. Therefore, naturalist authors applied quasi-scientific principles of objectivity and observation to examine how characters react when placed in adverse conditions. In effect, all naturalist fiction is also realist, but the reverse is not always true. Blow the candle out. I don't need to see what color my thoughts are. Germinal. Documentary realism. The leading figure of the naturalist movement was the French writer Émile Zola. Germinal is Zola's 13th novel in the 20-volume Rugen-Macert series, subtitled The Natural and Social History of a Family Under the Second Empire, in which he studies the deterministic effects of heredity and environment on different characters within a single extended family. In the new French Revolutionary calendar, Germinal was the name of the spring month, when plants begin to sprout. The title thus refers, optimistically, to the possibility of a better future. Zola depicts the life of a mining community in northern France, portraying the struggle between capital and labor as well as the inexorable workings of the environment and heredity on his frequently ill-fated characters. He researched the background to his story minutely, inspired in part by miners' strikes in 1869 and 1884. Zola deploys a forensic realism to evoke the mine, which becomes almost a character in itself. The use of imagery and metaphors give it a heightened reality. It is an ogre, a voracious monster, sucking in and devouring the insect-like workers. In Zola's Rugen-Macert series, the main characters are all descended from a single matriarch, Adelaide Fouquet. Through them, Zola explores his theories of heredity, the way in which inherited traits, such as alcoholism or madness, play themselves out differently but inexorably in generation after generation. Hope for the future. The novel's main protagonist is the educated but volatile Étienne Lantier, the son of an alcoholic, who loses his job after assaulting his boss. Étienne arrives in Monceau, where he finds work in the mine. Wary of an inherited propensity for violence, he tries to avoid alcohol. His position as an outsider allows him to evaluate the suffering and injustice he sees, and to pity the plight of the people. As the novel progresses, poverty and working conditions worsen, to such an extent that the workers go on strike, with the idealistic Étienne as their leader. When riots and violent repression ensue, the miners blame him. Despite the brutality and desolation, Étienne retains his belief in the potential germination of a better society. Dominated by Zola, literary naturalism was a relatively short-lived movement in Europe, but it went on to flourish in the USA, where authors such as Stephen Crane, Jack London, Theodore Dreiser, and Upton Sinclair explored in diverse ways the effects of environment on their characters. Émile Zola. Émile Zola was born in Paris in 1840, his father died in 1847, leaving the family to struggle financially. In 1862 Zola got a job at the publishing firm Hachette and supplemented his income by writing critical articles for periodicals. 3 years later, his reputation established, he made the decision to support himself by literary work alone, and in 1865 published his first novel, Claude's Confession. In 1898 Zola famously intervened in the Dreyfus Affair, in which a Jewish army officer was wrongfully convicted of treason. Zola wrote an open letter critical of the general staff that became known as J'accuse. This act led to his being found guilty of libel and he fled to England. He was allowed to return to France in 1899. Zola died in 1902, from carbon monoxide poisoning due to a blocked flue. Some believe that his death may not have been an accident, but instead the work of anti-Dreyfusards. Other key works. 1867 Therese Raquin, 1877 L'Assommoir, 1890 La Bête Humaine. See also, Tess of the d'Urberville, Far from the Madding Crowd, A Doll's House, The Red Badge of Courage, Sister Carrie. In context. Focus, pathetic fallacy. Before. 1807 William Wordsworth employs pathetic fallacy in his poem, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er valleys and hills. 1818 It was on a dreary night in November. Mary Shelley opens Chapter 5 of Frankenstein with foreboding elemental forces. 1847 Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte uses the weather on the moors to represent human emotion. After 1913 in Sons and Lovers by English novelist D. H. Lawrence, the moods of characters are reflected by evoking the environment around them. 1922 The opening of T. S. Eliot's modernist poem The Waste Land portrays the season of spring as cruel. A strong connection with the landscape and nature runs through the works of the English writer Thomas Hardy. This relationship was a reflection of the author's tremendous love of Dorset, the county where he was born, and where he set all of his major novels. In Tess of the d'Urberville, nature represents the authenticity and spontaneity of traditional, rural life. If nature suffers, then Hardy is pointing to powerful, modern forces, which are depicted not only as destructive but also more broadly as indicative of human suffering. Through Hardy's use of pathetic fallacy, Tess Durbeyfield is shown as being in harmony with nature, which reflects her character and moods. The term pathetic fallacy was coined by art critic John Ruskin in 1856, and refers to the attribution of human behavior and emotions to nature. This device was often used in 19th-century novels. Tess is first shown as an innocent. She is dancing, a maiden in white, as part of a May Day celebration, and captures the attention of Angel Clare, whom she too notices. Although the author asserts in his subtitle that Tess is pure, evoking a Christian sentiment, she appears at first to be the embodiment and celebration of the pagan, feminine, and natural. The series of misfortunes that shapes Tessa's story is precipitated by the suggestion that she is descended from an aristocratic Norman family, the d'Urberville. This revelation distances Tess from her natural self, Angel's new-sprung child of nature, and eventually leads to consequences. As events unfold, and Tessa's life becomes entangled with Alec d'Urberville, she is depicted in more disturbing settings, such as beneath an inflamed sun or in bewildering, mist-shrouded forests. In an intense example of pathetic fallacy, she wakes in a wood to find herself surrounded by dying pheasants, hunted and abandoned, and she is forced to show mercy by ending their agony. Reflecting on her own misery, she is humbled by the suffering of the birds. Pathetic fallacy is used by Hardy and other writers to link human emotions to aspects of nature, for example, using references to the weather to indicate mood, sunshine suggests happiness, rain misery, and a storm inner turmoil. Virtuous victim. But Tessa's love for Angel is pure, and Hardy shows that they can overcome adverse circumstances. They marry, but their happiness is disrupted. A cock crowing in the afternoon after their marriage ceremony is a bad omen. Angel is compelled by his background and upbringing to turn against Tess after she confesses to a turbulent past, despite agreeing that she was more sinned against than sinning. Hardy no longer represents her in nature, working in the fields or with animals. He places her in the new and lonely environment of a town, Sanborn, living as a kept mistress. The inevitability of fate. When Angel finally accepts that he wants to be with Tess, the lovers are reunited and experience a short-lived pastoral bliss before darkness sets in again. They retreat to the new forest, where, like nymphs, they promenade over the dry bed of fir needles, thrown into a vague intoxicating atmosphere at the consciousness of being together at last. Here Hardy again suggests Tessa's oneness with nature. The forest atmosphere evokes a joyful, pure love, which triumphs even over the prospect of death. The stone circle at the end of the novel represents both paganism and nature, and Tessa's sleep on the altar stone symbolizes her final, willing surrender to her fate. The atmosphere turned pale, the birds shook themselves in the hedges, arose and twittered, the lane showed all its white features and Tess showed hers, still whiter. Tess of the d'Urberville. Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy was born in Dorset in 1840, the son of a stonemason and builder, and at the age of 16 became an architect's apprentice. When he was 22 he moved to London, but after 5 years, concerned for his health and yearning to write, he returned to Dorset. Hardy set all his major novels in the southwest of England, and named his fictional landscape, Wessex, after the medieval Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Although many of the novel's locations are real, he always gave them fictional names. Hardy was disposed to write about suffering and tragedy. The death of his estranged first wife, Emma, in 1912 led him to write some of his finest love poetry. After his death in 1928, his ashes were interred in Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey while his heart was buried with Emma. Other key works: 1874 Far